This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. On January 3, 1924, an article called "What is American Music?" appeared in the New York Herald, announcing that bandleader Paul Whiteman would be presenting a concert that he called an experiment in modern music. It was to be the first crossover concert fusing classical and popular jazz, and Whiteman claimed that Irving Berlin is writing a syncopated tone poem, Victor Herbert is working on an American suite, and George Gershwin is at work on a jazz concerto. This was news to Gershwin. He and Whiteman had discussed the idea a year earlier when they worked together on a Broadway show, but other projects had come up and Gershwin had forgotten about it. The next day he called Whiteman, who reminded him about their discussion and apologized for the surprise in the article. It seems that a rival conductor had suddenly announced plans for a similar concert, and Whiteman was forced to move up his schedule if he didn't want to look like a copycat. They managed to sort things out, and Gershwin later wrote that my association with Whiteman in that show, I am sure, had something to do with Paul's asking me to write a composition for his first jazz concert. As you may know, I wrote the Rhapsody in Blue for that occasion, and there is no doubt that this was my start in the field of more serious music. Gershwin did agree to write a piece for Whiteman's concert, but given the short time frame, not to mention the fact that he was breaking new musical ground, a full-length concerto was out of the question. He did commit to some sort of free-form work, like a rhapsody, which would spotlight him as the soloist backed by the Whiteman band. But he was worried about the orchestration. For his Broadway work, he had always just written the tunes and left the instrumentation up to an arranger. Whiteman suggested his own pianist and arranger, Ferdy Grofé, who would find his own fame a few years later with his Grand Canyon Suite. Gershwin agreed, and on January 7th, he began to write. Gershwin's first score was for two pianos, one for his solo, the other for the orchestration, and Grofé later said that he practically lived at the Gershwins' apartment, picking up and delivering scores. It took Gershwin about a month to write the piece. As usual, it wasn't the only thing he was working on. At one point, he took a trip to Boston for the premiere of his musical Sweet Little Devil. He later recalled, quote, "It was on the train, with its steely rhythms, its rattly bang that is often so stimulating to a composer, and there I suddenly heard and even saw on paper the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, of our unduplicated national pep, of our metropolitan madness. By the time I reached Boston, I had a definite plot of the piece." End quote. It was Ira Gershwin, George's brother and lyricist, who came up with the title. He was inspired by a visit to an art gallery showing an exhibit of paintings by James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Whistler liked to give his paintings abstract titles, no matter the subject. The painting we know as Whistler's Mother is actually titled Arrangement in Gray and Black. George and Ira decided they liked this idea, and so George's new work became Rhapsody in Blue. The word blue naturally evokes the blues and, by extension, jazz, which was Whiteman's point when he commissioned the piece. But at its heart, Gershwin's Rhapsody is really a symphonic work. Its ancestors are more like Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky, and Liszt than Jelly Roll Morton, King Oliver, and W.C. Handy. The opening of Rhapsody in Blue is almost as famous these days as the opening of Beethoven's Fifth, but it almost didn't happen that way. Gershwin and Grofé had precisely notated the opening as a low clarinet trill followed by a scale rising rapidly through 17 notes. At one of the rehearsals, Whiteman's clarinetist, Ross Gorman, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps as a joke, turned it into a glissando, a sweeping ribbon of uninterrupted pitches. Gershwin told him to keep it and add as much wail as possible, and the rest is music history. Leonard Bernstein once called the Rhapsody a string of separate paragraphs stuck together, but those themes are terrific, God-given, end quote. They start with an oscillating bluesy tune. Then a brassy march-like melody, and finally a grandly romantic theme in the strings. Except for the people who were there, nobody knows how the Rhapsody actually sounded that day. Gershwin improvised quite a bit, including one whole page of the score which had only the scribbled instruction to Whiteman to wait for nod. And Ferdy Grofé actually made 3 orchestrations of the piece, the original for Whiteman's dance band, a second in 1926 for a Broadway pit orchestra, and the third in 1942 for full orchestra, which is the arrangement that is most often heard these days. Gershwin always said that it was Grofé's orchestration that made the piece so successful, but they did have a falling out when Grofé had himself credited as the composer in one published edition. The premiere of Rhapsody in Blue was not a universal success. The New York Tribune called it trite, feeble, and conventional, but the audience gave it a standing ovation. And Walter Damrosch, the director of the New York Symphony Society, was sufficiently impressed to commission Gershwin to write a real piano concerto, the piece that would become his Concerto in F. Gershwin was still worried about his ability to write a full-length work, so he contacted several well-known composers to ask if he could take lessons with them. According to legend, it was either Maurice Ravel or Igor Stravinsky who replied, "Mr. Gershwin, I have heard about your income. Perhaps I should take lessons from you." This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.